My brother in flesh, but not in stock. John Green.
So Hazel Lancaster and Augustus Waters have just met at a support group for kids with cancer, and Hazel has found herself rather quickly in Augustus's basement bedroom. A shelf at my eye level reached all the way around the room, and it was stuffed solid with basketball memorabilia. Dozens of trophies with gold plastic men mid-jump shot, or dribbling, or reaching for a layup toward an unseen basket. There were also lots of signed balls and sneakers. I used to play basketball, he explained. You must have been pretty good. I wasn't bad, but all the shoes and balls are cancer perks. He walked toward the TV where a huge pile of DVDs and video games were arranged into a vague pyramid shape. He bent at the waist and snatched up V for Vendetta. I was like the prototypical white Hoosier kid, he said. I was all about resurrecting the lost art of the mid-range jumper. But then one day I was shooting free throws, like just standing at the foul line at the North Central gym, shooting from a rack of balls. And all at once, I couldn't figure out why I was methodically tossing a spherical object through a toroidal object. It seemed like the stupidest thing I could possibly be doing. I started thinking about little kids putting a cylindrical peg through a circular hole and how they do it over and over again for months when they figure it out, and how basketball was basically just a slightly more aerobic version of that same exercise. Anyway, for the longest time I just kept sinking free throws. I hit like 80 in a row, my all-time best. But as I kept going, I felt more and more like a 2-year-old. And then for some reason I started to think about hurdlers. Are you okay? I'd taken a seat on the corner of his unmade bed. I wasn't trying to be suggestive or anything. I just got kind of tired when I had to stand a lot. I'd stood in the living room, and then there had been the stairs, and then more standing, which was quite a lot of standing for me, and I didn't want to faint or anything. I was a bit of a Victorian lady, fainting-wise. I'm fine, I said. I'm just listening. Hurdlers? Yeah, hurdlers. I don't know why. I started thinking about them running their hurdle races and jumping over these totally arbitrary objects that had been set in their path. And I wondered if hurdlers ever thought, you know, this would go faster if we just got rid of the hurdles. This was before your diagnosis, I asked? Right, well, there was that too. He smiled with half his mouth. The day of the existentially fraught free throws was coincidentally also my last day of dual-leggedness. I had a weekend between when they scheduled the amputation and when it happened. My own little glimpse of what Isaac is going through. I nodded. I liked Augustus Waters. I really, really liked him. I liked the way his story ended with someone else. I liked his voice. I liked that he took existentially fraught free throws. I liked that he was a tenured professor in the Department of Slightly Crooked Smiles with a dual appointment in the Department of having a voice that made my skin feel more like skin. And I liked that he had 2 names. I've always liked people with 2 names, because you get to make up your mind about what you call them. Gus or Augustus. Me, I was always just Hazel. Univalent Hazel. So what's your story? He asked, sitting down next to me at a safe distance. I already told you my story. I was diagnosed when I was... No, not your cancer story. Your story. Interest, hobbies, passions, weird fetishes, etc. I said, don't tell me you're one of those people who becomes the disease. I know so many people like that. It's disheartening, like cancer is in the growth business, right? The taking people over business. But surely you haven't let it succeed prematurely. It occurred to me that perhaps I had. I struggled with how to pitch myself to Augustus Waters, which enthusiasms to embrace. And in the silence that followed, it occurred to me that I wasn't very interesting. I'm pretty unextraordinary. I reject that out of hand. Think of something you like, anything, the first thing that comes to mind. Reading? What do you read? Everything, from like hideous romance to pretentious fiction to poetry, whatever. Do you write poetry too? No, I don't write. There! Augustus almost shouted. Hazel Grace, you are the only teenager in America who prefers reading poetry to writing it. This tells me so much. You read a lot of capital G great books, don't you? I guess. What's your favorite? I said. My favorite book, by a wide margin, was An Imperial Affliction. but I didn't like to tell people about it. Sometimes you read a book and it fills you with this weird evangelical zeal, and you become convinced that the shattered world will never be put back together unless and until all living humans read the book. And then there are books like An Imperial Affliction, which you can't tell people about. Books so special and rare and yours that advertising your affection feels like a betrayal. It wasn't even that the book was so good or anything. It was just that the author, Peter Van Houten, seemed to understand me in weird and impossible ways. An Imperial Affliction was my book, in the way that my body was my body, and my thoughts were my thoughts. But even so, I told Augustus. My favorite book is probably An Imperial Affliction, I said. Does it feature zombies? He asked. No, I said. Stormtroopers? I shook my head. It's not that kind of book. He smiled. I'm going to read this terrible book with the boring title that does not contain stormtroopers. I immediately felt like I shouldn't have told him about it. Augustus spun around to a stack of books beneath his bedside table. He grabbed a paperback and a pen. As he scribbled an inscription onto the title page, he said, "All I ask in exchange is that you read this brilliant and haunting novelization of my favorite video game." He held up the book, which was called The Price of Dawn. I laughed and took it. Our hands kind of got muddled together in the book handoff, and then he was holding my hand. "Cold," he said, pressing a finger to my pale wrist. "Not cold so much as under-oxygenated," I said. "I love it when you talk medical to me." He stood and pulled me up with him and did not let go of my hand until we reached the stairs. Later, pulling up at my house, I put the car in park and looked over at him. He really was beautiful. I know boys aren't supposed to be, but he was. "Hazel Grace," he said, my name new and better in his voice. "It has been a real pleasure to make your acquaintance." "Ditto, Mr. Waters," I said. I felt shy looking at him. I couldn't match the intensity of his water blue eyes. "May I see you again?" he asked. There was an endearing nervousness in his voice. I smiled. "Sure. Tomorrow?" he asked. "Patience, Grasshopper," I counseled. "You don't want to seem overeager." "Right, that's why I said tomorrow," he said. "I want to see you again tonight, but I'm willing to wait all night and watch you tomorrow." I rolled my eyes. "I'm serious," he said. "You don't even know me," I said. I grabbed the book from the center console. "How about I call you when I finish this?" "But you don't even have my phone number," he said. "I strongly suspect you wrote it in the book." He broke out into that goofy smile. "And you say we don't know each other." So that's a little bit from the second chapter of my new book, The Fault in Our Stars. The Fault in Our Stars is the story of these two kids, Hazel and Augustus, and their friend Isaac, as they have to travel through a lot of the ordinary things that teenagers have to travel through, and then also some of the less ordinary things, like having to confront in a real and immediate way our temporariness. And their temporariness as individuals. And in that part of the story, I read that partly because it allowed me to pretend to be a girl, thinking of boys. That would be uncomfortable for all y'all. No, thanks. But partly because that's sort of the first moment in the novel when you sense the tension between the way that Hazel imagines what a life is supposed to be, what a life well lived is supposed to be, what a successful life looks like, in the way that Augustus imagines it. Hazel gives Augustus this literary novel called An Imperial Affliction, and Augustus gives Hazel this, shoot-'em-up novelization in which this guy named Staff Sergeant Max Mayhem, kills 119 people in 221 pages. And that idea of heroism, that idea that a life well lived involves these grand acts of sacrifice, generally like jumping on a grenade to save your buddies, or dying because committing suicide because the great love of your life is unavailable to you because the Montagues and the Capulets have some disagreements, or whatever it is. The romantic epics, particularly the star-crossed romantic epics of our history, tend to not tend to be lived on this huge scale. You know, I always think of Odysseus returning from finally getting back at the end of the Odyssey, right? Do you guys know what I'm going to say? Okay. Finally gets back at the end of the Odyssey, and you know, here are all these dudes hanging out with his wife, eating his food, and like the rivers run with blood, and that is our satisfying ending. But in fact, let me submit to you that that is an inappropriate reaction to returning home and finding that your wife has suitors. You've been gone a long time, dude. She had no word of you. And these big romantic star-crossed epics that we read about, they shape the way that we imagine how lives are supposed to be lived and what constitutes a successful life and what constitutes a heroic life. And these kids in this novel don't have that kind of heroism available to them. But neither do most of us. And the struggle that Augustus and Hazel both face is finding a way to live a good and valuable life in a world that often tells us that lives cannot be good and valuable unless they are either long or sacrificially heroic. So I wanted to write, when I started out The Fault in Our Stars, which was almost 12 years ago, I wanted to write a little epic. I wanted to write a little love story that wouldn't be about, you know, the Montagues and the Capulets at war. It wouldn't be about war at all. It wouldn't be about family or politics. It would be about disease and the way that it shapes and circumscribes our life. And hopefully, my goal in writing that story would be to find a way to celebrate all kinds of lives and to argue that, you know, many kinds of lives, including ones that are not as long as they ought to be, can be beautiful and can be valuable. So that was a lot of what inspired this story. The other thing that I want to say before I bring out my brother is that when I started working on this story, I had just finished working as a student chaplain at a children's hospital in Ohio, which I did for about 5 months right after I graduated from college. And during that time, I met a lot of sick kids and spent a lot of time with sick kids, and they were nothing like my expectation, which was to meet these, you know, sad but wise-eyed children who, like, knew the secrets of life, who just, like, stared deeply enough into their pupils or whatever. And because I had been given that expectation by generations and generations of novels about sick people. And the truth of what I encountered, at least, was that people who are sick are very much like people who are well, except that they are sick. And that was really, really important for me in writing this novel. But that said, I spent 8 years between 2000 and 2008 failing at writing it. And along the way, I wrote some other books. But every time I would finish something, I would come back to what I called the hospital story, and I would try to write it again. It was a funny book. It was about this dashingly handsome but alcoholic hospital chaplain. And here's, you know, like, all the positive influence he had on all these kids. And I would, like, send it to my editor, and she would be like, "This is all right, but can we get rid of the chaplain?" And I'd be like, "Absolutely not." And it wasn't until I became friends with a nerdfighter named Esther Earl that I was finally able to write the story, because Esther was sick and has since died, but it wasn't so much her illness that allowed me a way into the story. It was meeting a genuinely empathetic teenager. Like, I don't mean that as an insult to you, but I'm not empathetic either, and I'm in my 30s. So, but to meet someone who is able to turn outward in the way that Hazel is was the key revelation to being able to write this story. To meet someone who could have an honest awareness of her surroundings in the way that Hazel does, and that was the key. And then the book, you know, it was only 3 quick years from there. And I'm going to answer a lot of questions about The Fault in Our Stars tonight and talk more about it. But right now, I feel like this topic that I've been talking about heroism and how we live heroic lives is perhaps best discussed in song.